Tone, kid. Watch it. The flight attendant's breath hitched, face purple. 10-year-old Keon, silver unaccompanied minor tag gleaming, just wanted juice. Apple, like the menu said. Confusion clouded his eyes. The attendant saw sass where there was only innocence. A lesson needed teaching. What he didn't see, what fueled my rage from 3B, was the quiet strength in that kid's soft voice, or the careful notes I was already taking. They thought they were silencing a child. Jokes on them. Keon's kindness was a slow burn, and they had no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. Nor could he know the boy's father was a former military strategist. The flight attendant thought he was asserting control. In reality, he was about to trigger his own complete dismantlement. You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who believe no black child should be punched into silence will do it before this story begins. Watch your tone. Clark Denham muttered, his voice low and sharp. The sentence cut through the calm hum of the airplane cabin like a sudden crack of thunder. Keon Hart, just 10 years old, blinked up at the towering flight attendant, confusion flickering in his wide brown eyes. He hadn't meant to be disrespectful. He was just reading from the menu. The apple juice was listed right there in clean, bold letters. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded anything. He just asked politely. "I wasn't being rude," he replied softly. And with those words, everything changed. Clark's jaw twitched. He stood rigid, his arms stiff at his sides, fingers flexing slightly. Around them, the priority cabin of Flight 2703 remained still. Passengers were settling in overhead compartments, clicking shut, seatbelts tightening. The air carried the faint smell of recycled oxygen, coffee, and jet fuel. But for Keon, the atmosphere felt denser, like the gravity around him had just shifted. He was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd boarded with a silver unaccompanied minor tag hanging from a thin chain around his neck, his hands carefully gripping the edges of his backpack. A gate agent had smiled and directed him to seat 2B, a cushioned window seat in the priority cabin, clearly meant for business travelers, not 10-year-olds. But no one had questioned it. Not at first. Not until Clark Denham spotted him stepping into the section like he didn't belong there. Clark had watched the boy take his seat with a look that was more than just annoyance. It was disdain, the kind that bubbles just beneath the surface of a carefully pressed uniform. Keon hadn't noticed. He'd smiled at the other passengers, tucked his bag beneath the seat, and pulled out the coloring book his dad had packed. His voice had been quiet when he asked for juice, almost shy, and the request was small enough to go unnoticed until Clark snapped back with a gruff, "We're out." That was the moment the mood shifted. Keon had tilted his head slightly and pointed to the laminated menu tucked in the seat pocket. "But the menu says there is," he'd said with genuine innocence. "That's what did it." Now Clark loomed above him like a shadow. The veins in his neck stood out. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a line so tight it was almost invisible. He didn't move yet, but the tension in his body made it feel like a storm was about to hit. Keon's seat suddenly felt too big. The seat belt buckle dug into his side. He wasn't used to this kind of reaction. Adults usually liked him. He was soft-spoken, polite, thoughtful. He followed rules. His mom had told him to be extra polite during the flight, especially because he was traveling alone. "Just smile, be kind, and say please and thank you," she'd said. He'd done exactly that. So why did this man look like he wanted to hurt him? Clark stepped forward closer than necessary, blocking the aisle with his body. Another flight attendant passed behind him, a younger man named Tim, but he didn't stop. He barely looked over. Maybe he hadn't heard the tension, or maybe he didn't want to get involved. Keon looked away from Clark's face, glancing toward the seat across the aisle, where a man in a navy blue suit had just opened a tablet and was typing. The man seemed calm, detached, but Keon noticed the slight pause in his fingers, the way his eyes had flicked up briefly toward the interaction. He was watching quietly, measuring. The engines roared to life beneath them, a gentle vibration rumbling through the floor. The final boarding call had been made, and the aircraft began to push back from the gate. Keon felt a knot form in his stomach, not because of the movement, but because something about the way Clark was looking at him had shifted. The man's eyes had darkened. He wasn't just annoyed anymore. He was angry deeply, strangely, Watch your tone, Clark repeated just loud enough for the words to settle into the air like poison. I wasn't being rude, Keon said again, his voice trembling slightly this time, like a string pulled too tight. He didn't know it yet, but he had just walked into a trap. One carefully laid one designed not for justice or order, but for control, pure and simple. Clark Denham's fist slammed into Keon Hart's face with such brutal speed and force that for a heartbeat time seemed to freeze. The sound of knuckles against bone echoed like a firecracker in the narrow cabin space. The boy's head snapped sideways, jerking violently over the armrest as his small frame crumpled. There was a sickening thud as his temple struck the seat's edge, followed by a sharp metallic clink, the sound of his silver unaccompanied minor tag hitting the tray table. Then silence, thick and stunned. Keon didn't scream. He couldn't. Just a small, broken whimper escaped his lips, barely audible over the gasps rising from passengers nearby. His face was already swelling, his jaw unnaturally skewed, and thin streams of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, soaking into his shirt and the side of the seat cushion. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then came the chaos. A middle-aged man in the row behind leapt to his feet, eyes wide in disbelief. A younger man across the aisle fumbled for his phone, hands trembling. An elderly passenger clutched her chest and whispered a prayer, but the figure who stood out most was the one in row 1. A tall man in a navy blue tailored suit, clean-shaven, composed, and utterly still. Slowly he rose from his seat. Clark Denham, still standing in the aisle where he had thrown the punch, looked around as if daring someone to challenge him. His square jaw twitched and his fists remained clenched, the tension visible in the seamus of his forearms. He didn't look panicked. He looked justified. He got smart, Clark muttered, glancing over his shoulder, but never meeting anyone's eyes. Disrespect like that earns a lesson. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the cabin. Keon groaned softly, his face resting on the edge of the armrest, breath hitching in shallow bursts. The bright cabin lights above caught the shimmer of blood smeared across his cheek. A few seats down, a teenage boy reached for the call button, repeatedly, his voice cracking as he called for help. Clark turned sharply at the sound. Behind him, a young male flight attendant, barely older than 20, stood frozen near the galley curtain, his hand halfway to his radio. He stared at Clark as if trying to determine whether he was looking at a colleague or a threat. Call medical, the suited man in row 1A said firmly without raising his voice. Now the young attendant jumped, nodded quickly, and slipped behind the curtain. A soft click followed as the intercom was engaged. In the silence that followed, even the overhead engines felt quieter. Clark's breathing had grown shallow, the kind that signaled an adrenaline high. He glanced at the man in the suit, who was now stepping into the aisle. The two locked eyes. For a moment, it was as if the other passengers disappeared entirely. The suited man's expression was unreadable, calm, measured, but with a glint of something sharper behind his eyes. Authority, the kind that didn't come from a uniform. Clark's jaw twitched again, his posture stiffening. I said he got smart. He repeated louder now, as if saying it again would make it true. You all saw it. He talked back. No one responded. The man in the suit took another slow step forward. His shoes made a soft tap against the cabin floor. And you decided that justified violence? He asked quietly, the question hanging in the air, like a dropped blade. Clark's eyes narrowed, the heat in his face returning. Don't twist it. He disrespected me. I gave him a warning. The suited man glanced down at Keon's slumped body. The boy hadn't moved. He's a child, the man said now, standing just a few feet away. You struck a child. Clark's lips curled slightly defensive. You don't know what happened. You weren't close enough to hear. The man lifted his left hand, revealing a silver boarding pass still clutched in his fingers. I was in row 1A. I heard everything. Clark opened his mouth, then hesitated. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, but he buried it quickly. The curtain parted again as the young flight attendant reappeared, his voice shaking. Medical team's meeting us at the gate, he said. They're bringing a stretcher. A wave of tension rippled through the passengers. A few began murmuring, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One man pulled out his phone and began recording, tilting the lens just enough to catch both Clark and the suited man in the frame. Clark noticed his face twitching again. "Don't record me," he snapped, but the phone stayed up. The suited man ignored the outburst and turned slightly, addressing the rest of the cabin. "I need you all to stay calm. Remain in your seats. Medical will be here shortly." Lark, fists still clenched, took a step backward toward the galley. "What's your name?" the suited man asked. Clark paused. "I asked you a question." The flight attendant clearly rattled, looked from one man to the other. Clark Clark muttered reluctantly. The suited man nodded once, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Denham, you've just made a very serious mistake." The wheels of Flight 2703 screeched against the tarmac as the aircraft came to a smooth but urgent stop at Skyland International Airport. Outside the windows, emergency vehicles stood waiting, red and blue lights flashing in rhythmic pulses across the cabin walls. The atmosphere inside the plane was heavy with unease. No one spoke above a whisper. A child had been attacked, and now the consequences had landed both literally and figuratively. Two paramedics in Navy uniforms rushed up the jet bridge the moment the cabin door opened. One carried a collapsible stretcher, the other a medical bag, his face unreadable behind the steady professionalism of someone trained for trauma. A young male flight officer guided them forward, quickly gesturing towards seat 2B, where Keon Hart lay slumped sideways, his face pale and lips trembling. Blood had dried along the side of his chin, and his shirt was stiff where it had soaked into the collar. Keon didn't cry. He hadn't since the initial blow. His body remained still, except for the occasional flinch when movement jostled his jaw. One of the paramedics knelt beside him, speaking softly. "Can you hear me, buddy?" "Nod if you can hear me." Keon's eyes fluttered open. He gave the faintest nod. Behind them, the cabin was frozen in a collective hush. Passengers leaned just slightly over armrests, watching but not daring to speak. The suited man from seat 1A, tall, composed, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, stood up slowly. He hadn't moved since the assault only watched, but now something had shifted in him. He smoothed down his tie and stepped into the aisle. At the front of the plane near the emergency exit, Clark Denham stood with his arms crossed, shoulders squared, as if he were the one needing reassurance. His lips were pressed into a straight line, and he spoke in low tones to a gate officer who had just boarded. "The kid got too close," Clark said, nodding toward the back. Dave his arms knocked a drink tray. "He startled me. I reacted. It wasn't intentional." The officer scribbled on a notepad, glancing nervously toward the commotion. "And you struck him in the face." "I defended myself," Clark replied quickly, his tone curt. "He got aggressive." The officer looked uncomfortable. "He's 10. Clark's jaw tightened, but before he could speak again, the man from 1A stepped forward, card in hand. His voice was calm, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Judge Marcel Durham, 5th Circuit Court." The officer's eyes widened. He took the card with both hands, quickly reading the embossed lettering. "Sir, you witnessed the incident." "I was seated directly across from the boy," Judge Durham replied evenly. There was no threat. There was no aggression. Just a quiet child who asked for apple juice and was assaulted without cause. Clark's face shifted for the first time, not to remorse, but to recognition. He opened his mouth, but whatever he planned to say died in his throat. The gate officer stepped back and signaled a nearby crewman who immediately called in additional security. The decision had been made. Clark Denham was no longer explaining. He was being questioned. "Mr. Denham," the officer said, voice firmer, "now you'll need to come with us to the interview room. Please don't speak to anyone else until we've reviewed witness statements." Clark looked around at the passengers watching him at the camera phones now being raised with quiet deliberation. The confident posture drained from his frame as two airport security guards approached. He raised his hands instinctively. "This is a mistake," but no one replied. In the background, the paramedics gently transferred Keon to the stretcher. He whimpered once, a sound more of discomfort than fear, and clutched the blanket they placed over him. The straps were fastened. A neck brace was secured. The lead medic whispered something into his radio before nodding at the captain. The pilot who had remained in the cockpit during the ordeal now stepped into the cabin and took the intercom. His voice echoed overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Skyreach Airlines, We extend our sincere apologies for the events that have occurred. Medical staff are attending the injured passenger. Please remain seated until we've received clearance to deboard. Passengers exchange glances. No one angry, just as stunned. Word of the incident was already traveling down the private pilot networks, reaching terminals, control towers, and internal departments. The story was unfolding in real time faster than anyone could contain it. As Keon was wheeled down the Jet Bridge airport, cameras flicked silently overhead. A small group of reporters had gathered at the bottom, tipped off by a medic who recognized Judge Durham on the flight manifest. Keon's arrival was met with camera flashes, though the paramedics blocked the view with practiced precision. 2 hours later at Skyland Memorial Hospital, the double doors to the emergency wing burst open. Marcus Hart stepped inside, his face shadowed with panic. He wore a black button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, and his pace was unbroken as he passed the front desk. "My son, Keon Hart, he was just brought in from a flight. I'm his father." The receptionist pointed down the hallway. "Room 3B, sir. Trauma observation." Marcus didn't thank her. He moved like a man chasing time. Inside the room, Keon lay beneath a light blue hospital sheet, V dripped in one arm jaw, encased in a stabilizing wrap. A young male nurse adjusted the heart monitor while glancing over notes. When Marcus entered, he froze mid-step. The sight of his son, bloodied, swollen, silent, hit him like a body blow. He walked to the bedside, slow, now hand trembling slightly as he reached for Keon's. The boy stirred at his presence, but couldn't speak. Marcus didn't cry. He didn't rage. He leaned close, brushing back a stray curl from Keon's forehead. Then, in a low, cold voice, he asked the only question that mattered. "Who did this to my boy?" Clark Denham sat rigidly in the cold metal chair of the private security room at Skyland Airport, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The room was small, sterile with dull gray walls and a single frosted window that gave the illusion of privacy. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale sheen across the table between him and the two internal airline investigators seated across from him. One was stocky balding and wore a navy vest with a Skyreach emblem stitched to the left breast. The other was younger, slimmer with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard that rarely left his hand. "We just need your statement," the balding investigator said, his voice even but tinged with urgency. "Tell us exactly what happened from your point of view." Clark leaned back in his chair and gave a short, irritated breath. "I want a union rep before I say anything else," he snapped. The younger investigator adjusted his glasses. "That's your right. But we still need to understand what led to the incident. From what we've been told, the boy Clark cut him off." "That boy got physical first," he said firmly. He waved his arms too close to my face. I acted on instinct. Anyone would have. He sat up straighter, placing both hands on the table as if to ground himself in authority. "People don't understand what it's like in the air. Passengers get agitated. Kids can be unpredictable. The injury, whatever it was, probably came from him falling into the armrest, not from me." There was silence for a moment. The younger investigator scribbled something down. The older one tilted his head slightly. "You're saying you didn't hit him?" he asked. "I'm saying people overreact when they see blood," Clark replied. "And if you're trying to pin this on me without hearing my side, you're making a mistake." What Clark didn't know was that the mistake had already been made and documented. In a conference room just 2 floors above, a supervisor was watching a video on a passenger's phone. It was silent except for the ambient cabin noise, but the images were crystal clear. From the moment Keon asked about the apple juice to the sudden brutal strike that snapped his head sideways, it was all there. A man in seat 1C had captured everything from across the aisle, holding his phone low and steady, barely blinking during the confrontation. The footage had already been forwarded to 2 local news stations, and more critically to Judge Marcel Durham's personal aide. The judge had wasted no time. He'd viewed the footage twice and passed it directly to airport security. That video was now evidence. In Sky Memorial Hospital's pediatric wing, Marcus Hart sat in a stiff-backed chair, his eyes fixed on the same footage playing on his phone. The room smelled of antiseptic and linoleum. Keon lay unconscious in the hospital bed beside him, his head swathed in gauze. a soft monitor beeping steadily with every breath he took. A trace of dried blood still marked the edge of the boy's mouth. Marcus hadn't moved for nearly an hour. He just watched, rewound, watched again. Every time the frame froze on Clark's fist, tightening just before impact, Marcus's jaw clenched tighter. The former strategist was known for his calm under pressure. Haven Corp had once trusted him to coordinate multinational deployments, crisis containment, and fail safes that protected lives across continents. But right now, none of that mattered. None of it could undo the sight of his 10-year-old son crumpling beneath the weight of a stranger's anger. A nurse stepped in quietly, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Hart," he said gently, "the doctors are reviewing the scans now. We'll know more about the fractures soon." Marcus didn't turn his head. "Thank you," he murmured. Then, as if speaking more to himself than the nurse, he whispered, "He chose the wrong boy." He rose slowly from the chair and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the terminal towers. He pressed his palm against the glass. His mind wasn't racing. It was sharpening. This wasn't just about a punch. It was about what had allowed the punch to happen. A man like Clark didn't snap in a vacuum. Downstairs, Clark Denham remained unaware of the gathering storm. His attorney hadn't arrived yet. He was growing frustrated. The investigator's silence made him uneasy. He leaned forward. "If you've got something to show me, then show it," he challenged, trying to reclaim control of the room. The older investigator exchanged a glance with his colleague, then reached into a folder and slid a still frame across the table. It was grainy but unmistakable. Clark's arm, extended fist, clenched the boy's head, beginning to recoil. Clark blinked, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "We're done here," the older investigator said. "You'll be escorted to holding for now. A representative will meet you there." As Clark was led out of the room by two security guards, his steps no longer carried the weight of confidence they dragged. Somewhere in the building, a copy of that same footage was being reviewed by legal counsel public relations and the airline's crisis team. The chain reaction had begun. Marcus stood by Keon's bedside again. The boy stirred slightly, his hand twitching against the blanket. Marcus took it gently in his own. A sharp knock came at the door. "Mr. Hart," a man said, poking his head in. "It was a hospital liaison. There's been some movement on the investigation. We thought you'd want to know." Marcus turned slowly, his voice. "Even I want names, records. Every person who signed off on that man's employment, I want it all." The liaison hesitated. "We're working on it, sir." "Work faster," Marcus said. He looked down at his son one more time. His tone softened, but the fire beneath it remained. "He chose the wrong boy," Marcus muttered under his breath. Clark Denham's name was now permanently etched in Marcus's mind. The crowd outside the Skyland Federal Courthouse shifted restlessly as reporters held their microphones high, cameras whirring beneath the gray morning sky. Judge Marcel Durham stepped up to the podium with a measured calm that silenced even the most aggressive press. Dressed in his signature dark overcoat, he looked like a man used to bearing storms and controlling them. This morning, he began, voice slow and unwavering. "I want to speak not just as a federal judge, but as a witness. What I saw on Flight 273 was not confusion or misunderstanding. It was violence, and no child deserves that kind of brutality, especially from someone trusted to care for them." The words hung in the air. Flashbulbs popped. Some reporters lowered their microphones, taken aback by the gravity in his tone. Durham didn't linger. With a short nod to the beau beside him, he stepped down from the podium and walked briskly back inside the courthouse, avoiding questions. The message had been delivered. The nation had heard it. Meanwhile, across the city, in a private law office on the 27th floor of the Garwin building, Clark Denham sat stiffly at a glass table beside his attorney. The air inside the room was sterile cold, the walls lined with legal texts and past victories framed in brass. Grant Maruro, a silver-haired defense attorney with a reputation for extending trials until they fizzled, leaned back in his chair, studying his client through narrowed eyes. "They're going to come hard," Grant said, "but that's just noise. What matters is what we put on record. You were provoked. You felt threatened. You acted on instinct. That's our story, and we're sticking to it." Clark's jaw tightened. It was just one punch, he muttered, his voice clipped. The kid wouldn't let it go. He kept pushing. Don't say that to anyone else, Grant snapped, pointing a finger. You're not the victim here. Not publicly. You're the man caught in a situation gone sideways. Say too much and they'll twist it. As Clark nodded, something flickered in his eyes. Not remorse, but annoyance. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong, that more than anything would become his undoing. At that same moment, Marcus Hart sat in a quiet corner booth of a diner on the east side of Skyland. His laptop opened a half-finished cup of black coffee in front of him. The morning sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, drawing faint golden lines across his weathered face. Two men slid into the booth across from him. Caleb Rohr and Lionel Sims, both former engineers he had worked with during his years consulting for Arison Systems. Marcus didn't greet them with small talk. Instead, he turned the screen toward them. This is what we know so far, he said. Lines of text scrolled across a shared document, passenger testimonies, dated internal reports, excerpts from email scrubbed of corporate signatures. Marcus tapped a highlighted section. Here, passenger complaint. 18 months ago, Clark was reported for yelling at a boy with special needs, filed under internal conduct review, then erased 2 weeks later. Caleb leaned in. We saw these patterns before, he said grimly. Remember Klein Rogers Security? They used the same tactic. Flag incidents just enough to be seen, then bury them quietly, Lionel added. And it's not just deleted reports. Look here. Flagged crew memos rewritten to sound like minor misunderstandings. If we cross-check timestamps, we might be able to recover the original versions from the data cache. Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard, eyes sharp with focus. The fury he'd felt in that hospital room was still there, but now it was channeled, calculated. He wasn't swinging wildly. He was aiming precisely. They worked for hours, their conversation low but urgent. They cataloged 6 distinct reports involving Clark Denham, each dismissed, rewarded, or outright removed from Skyreach's official logs. One involved a verbal threat toward a junior attendant, another a shouted tirade at an elderly passenger over a seating mix-up. Each had been explained away as training challenges or miscommunication. Marcus sat back, rubbing his chin. They knew. They always knew, he said. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim black flash drive, placing it on the table. Everything we've built, copy it, encrypt it, then send one to Durham's aide. I've already cleared the channel. Is this enough? Caleb asked. It's enough to start a fire, Marcus said. That evening, under dim fluorescent lights inside Judge Durham's private chambers, Marcus handed him a manila folder. It was thick, heavy, with printed evidence. Durham opened it without a word, his eyes scanning each page with practiced precision. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of paper. This is more than misconduct, Durham finally said. This is a system designed to cover itself. Marcus nodded once. This wasn't a moment of rage, he said, voice low but steady. This was a pattern waiting to explode, and the fuse had finally reached the charge. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind him, Clark Denham realized how deeply he was sinking. He sat stiffly in the pristine leather chair inside his attorney's downtown office, a space that smelled of polished wood, old money, and quiet desperation. The blinds were half drawn, slicing the morning sunlight into jagged bars that fell across the sleek conference table. Clark stared at the floor jaw clenched tight. Across from him, Grant Marrero adjusted his cufflinks, his voice even, but carrying the weight of strategy. You were provoked. You acted instinctively. You feared for your safety, Grant repeated, tapping a folder on the table. That's the only path we take forward. Clark nodded slowly, but his knuckles whitened around the edge of his chair. The confident nod was a mask. Inside, panic was blooming fast, flooding every thought with doubt. He had believed foolishly that this would all blow over. A kid with a smart mouth, a quick reaction. It should have ended with a write-up, maybe a reprimand, not with paramedics, media, firestorms, and federal judges involved. They've already labeled you, Grant added, flipping open the folder to reveal a printed headline. The punching attendant goes viral. Below the headline was a still image pulled from the video. Clark's fist mid-swing the boy's face moments before impact. This is what we're up against. Clark didn't respond. His gaze lingered on the image. The child's face haunted him, not because he regretted it, but because he hadn't seen it coming. Not the reaction, not the backlash, not the flood of fury that followed. Grant continued, voice clipped and precise. Sky Reach issued a carefully worded statement. They're not condemning you, but they're not protecting you either. They're buying time, waiting to see how deep this goes. Clark blinked hard, shaking his head as if trying to expel the noise from his mind. It was just a hit, he muttered. One punch. I didn't even mean to. That's not the narrative anymore, Grant interrupted, leaning forward, eyes sharp. You're not facing the airline's HR department. You're facing a judge with federal power, a national audience, and a father who knows how to weaponize truth. Clark's eyes narrowed. The father, Marcus Hart. His voice was low, bitter. Who is he? Grant slid another folder across the table. Former operations strategist for Haven Corp and defense sector, global logistics, psychological operations systems disruption. He doesn't scream. He doesn't protest. He dismantles. Clark felt a chill crawl down his spine. Right now, Marcus Hart isn't pacing a hospital floor worrying. Grant said he's planning mapping, gathering leverage. Clark stood abruptly and walked to the tall windows, staring down at the city traffic. Then what do? We get ahead of it, Grant replied. You authorize a counter-ute defamation, emotional distress. Say you were painted as a monster unfairly. We put Keon's family on the defensive. Clark hesitated. You really think a jury will believe I hit a kid in self-defense? Grant stood now, too, buttoning his coat. They don't have to believe it completely. They just have to doubt enough of it to soften the blow. But across the city, Marcus Hart was playing a far different game. In a dimly lit cafe tucked behind a publishing office, Marcus sat with a former colleague, a data analyst from their think tank days, sliding a flash drive across the table. Encrypted, Marcus said. Audio logs, dated reports, incident transcripts. Clark Denham's trail of misconduct didn't begin on Flight 2703. The analyst, a lean man with close-cropped hair and a focused stare, nodded once. We'll leak it in stages to the right outlet. Use the independent network, Marcus said. They're the only ones who don't bury stories under corporate pressure. The analyst pocketed the drive. You're not playing defense. I never was. Marcus left the cafe and stepped into the quiet evening, dialing another number as he walked. Is Dr. Rennick available? He asked. Tell him Marcus Hart is ready to move forward. Yes, forensic facial trauma. I need expert testimony on record. That same night, an anonymous complaint was filed with the National Aviation Conduct Board. It was meticulous, factual, professional, and irrefutable. Judge Marcel Durham was named as a corroborating witness. Inside the Sky Reach headquarters, panic began to trickle upward. Not from the public, not from the media, but from within. Someone had begun pulling thread after thread, and now the seams were tearing. Back at the legal office, Grant briefed Clark one last time before dismissing him. We control the story, Clark. We stick to the message. But even as he spoke, his phone vibrated with a new headline. Former Sky Reach employee speaks out. Clark was always looking to prove a point. Clark saw the headline, his stomach twisting. They're painting me like a predator. Grant hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before replying. You're not facing a PR problem, he said at last, lowering the phone slowly onto the table. His voice was quiet now, almost defeated. You're facing a father who knows how systems break and how to make them collapse. The sealed envelope slid across the table with a whisper, landing squarely in front of Marcus's heart. He didn't touch it at first. He just stared, his fingers laced tightly together, jaw set hard enough to hurt. Across from him sat a lean man in his early 40s with ash-gray stubble on his chin and lines carved deep into his forehead. Jason read former lead attendant at Sky Reach. His eyes didn't waver. I kept it all these years, Jason said quietly. Didn't know if I'd ever use it. But when I saw what he did to your son, I couldn't stay silent. Marcus opened the envelope, slowly sliding out a thin stack of crisp papers. At the top, a bold heading passenger misconduct complaint. 2018 transatlantic flight SR-47 and 8. Beneath it, in tight handwriting, a parent had detailed how their son, another unaccompanied minor, had been struck across the shoulder with a tray edge by flight attendant Clark Denham after asking for help. The boy had cried the entire flight. The complaint had signatures, timestamps, and even a crew roster. It was all there, but Marcus had been in enough boardrooms to know what else it was. Dangerous. This wasn't filed with HR, he muttered, flipping through the pages. This was buried. Jason nodded, eyes heavy with guilt. We were told it was handled internally. Next thing I knew, the family got a travel voucher and stopped pressing, but Clark bragged about it for weeks. Said, sometimes kids needed a reminder to stay quiet. Marcus's grip on the document tightened. The sterile lights above flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the conference table. How many others? He asked. At least 3 more incidents I personally witnessed. Verbal abuse threats. Never on paper, though. He was smart about that. Jason looked away. But this one I printed and kept just in case. Marcus rose slowly from his chair, sliding the paper back into the envelope with deliberate care. You've done the right thing now, he said, and I promise you this won't disappear. The door to the private lounge opened just enough for Marcus to see the dusk settling over Skyland City through the wide airport windows. The glow of runway lights flickered beyond the glass like silent signals, blinking in anticipation. Outside, as Marcus walked back to his car, he called Judge Durham. I need to meet urgently. There's something you need to see. Later that evening, in the dim warmth of the judge's study, the 2 men reviewed the sealed statement line by line. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of an antique clock on the mantel and the occasional hum of traffic beyond the window. Durham leaned back in his chair, brows furrowed. This predates Keon's case by 5 years. It confirms this wasn't an isolated breakdown. It was a pattern, and a pattern the airline helped suppress, Marcus added. His voice was low sharp. They buried this, which means someone high up signed off on it. Durham tapped a pen against his notebook. The problem isn't just Clark anymore. It's the structure that allowed him to keep hurting children without consequences. Marcus nodded slowly, his thoughts already racing ahead. Then it's time we show the structure. It's not untouchable. Over the next several days, Marcus contacted 2 former engineers he'd worked with years ago, both now contractors with data clearance for the airline's back-end systems. Through encrypted channels, they helped him retrieve fragments of past employee complaints flags buried in old databases, most labeled closed without cause. He pieced together a quiet map of rot. Clark's name kept surfacing adjacent to incidents that were never followed through. One internal note read, reported as temperamental but essential to crew balance. Another handled via informal talk. Issue not escalated. Marcus stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a metronome of rage. That night back at the hospital, Keon sat propped in bed watching a cartoon with the sound off. A thick bandage still ran across his jawline, and even the smallest smile made him wuss. He hadn't spoken in days. Marcus sat beside him, one hand gently covering his son's. He'd promised Keon healing. Now he had to make good on the second part justice. As the trial date was set for 3 weeks out, Marcus worked in silence. He forwarded documents called former staff scheduled interviews. Behind every action was strategy. He was no longer just a father. He was a man at war with an institution. Late one night, he met Jason again in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. Rain tapped at the windows like a slow drum beat, muffling the sounds outside. This doesn't stop with him, does it? Jason asked, his voice low. No, Marcus replied. Clark is just the door. What's behind it is bigger. Jason looked down at his coffee. You're going to take them all down, aren't you? Marcus didn't hesitate. I'm not fighting a man, he said. I'm fighting a whole culture, and I plan to win. If that moment made your blood boil and your heart ache, don't scroll. Subscribe and become a member, because letting violence go unchallenged means accepting it. The emails surfaced like a thunderclap. Late at night, just 3 days before the trial was set to begin, a whistleblower, using the alias Cabin, truth leaked a file of internal correspondence to 3 major news outlets. Within hours, the messages between Clark Denham and his direct supervisor began circulating online. The most damning line, one that would later be read aloud in court, was simple, chilling, and impossible to misinterpret. They always think they can talk back if they're young and entitled, especially that kind. It hit the public like a wave. By morning, protests had already begun forming outside Skyreach Airlines headquarters in downtown Skyland City. Men in suits stood nervously behind glass doors while chants echoed across the plaza. Signs bobbed above the crowd, not just to punch a pattern. Protect our kids and that kind, we know what you mean. Inside a quiet room on the 19th floor of the courthouse, Marcus Hart stood over a conference table cluttered with documents, statements, and still frames from the flight video. He didn't speak for a while, just stared at the paused image of Clark's fist midair, a fraction of a second before it connected with Keon's jaw. Behind him, a legal aide entered, carrying a file. "Mr. Hart, the court has accepted the whistleblower emails into evidence," the young man said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "And Clark Denham has been terminated. Skyreach made it official this morning." Marcus didn't smile. He didn't react. He simply gave a short nod and turned back to the image. "That won't stop his lawyer," he said flatly. "They'll pivot. Blame the airline. Call him a scapegoat." The aide hesitated. "You expected this?" "I planned for it." Elsewhere, Clark Denham sat stiffly beside his attorney, Grant Maruro, inside a dim, windowless legal chamber near the courthouse. He was dressed in a fresh navy suit, but his eyes were bloodshot. The termination had hit him hard. But it wasn't the loss of employment that disturbed him. It was the way the narrative had slipped out of his control. "They boxed us in," Clark muttered, running a trembling hand over his face. "Emails, witnesses, a judge, and that kid just sitting there milking the sympathy. I didn't mean to hit him like that. I mean, it wasn't." Grant cut him off with a raised hand. "Intent isn't the issue anymore, Clark. Optics are. You've officially been cast as the villain, and now the best defense we have is to paint the entire system as broken. You were a symptom, not the cause." Clark leaned back in his chair, his mouth a tight line, and if that fails, Grant didn't answer. On the morning of the trial, a crowd of reporters, activists, and silent onlookers gathered around the courthouse steps. Inside, tension wrapped every hallway like wire. Court officers paced the perimeter, and the media buzzed with predictions. In the lobby, Keon sat in a wheelchair, his face still bandaged his small frame, surrounded by quiet, unspoken support. Marcus crouched beside him, adjusting the boy's lap blanket. "You ready?" he asked gently. Keon gave a slight nod, his eyes heavy but calm. They entered the courtroom together. Judge Wilton Stokes presided seated behind a tall oak bench, his gray brows furrowed as he glanced over the pretrial briefs. Every seat was taken and toward the back, unnoticed by most. Judge Marcel Durham sat in plain clothes. Expression, unreadable arms crossed over his chest. The prosecutor began without ceremony. "We intend to show this court that the injury to Keon Hart was not only deliberate, but predictable based on the defendant's own words and actions." He lifted a tablet and connected it to the screen. The video began to play. The cabin lights flickered on. Keon asked for juice. Clark responded curtly. The second request, the answer sharpens. Then frame by frame, Clark's posture shifts. His shoulder tenses, his hand tightens. The punch lands. Gasps echoed as the room watched the moment in slow motion, not just once, but twice. The angle from the passenger's phone was clear, damning. And then the prosecutor paused the video. He let the still image hang in silence. A child mid-flinch, frozen in pain blood, just beginning to spatter his shirt collar. This, he said, stepping forward, his voice low and firm, was not an accident. It was a decision. "Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Leonard Bryce to the stand." The courtroom stirred as a man in a dark pinstripe suit, mid-50s with silver-rimmed glasses and a self-assured posture, rose from the front row and walked calmly to the witness box. Dr. Bryce was a body language expert, a former behavioral analyst with years of experience interpreting human movement. He had the demeanor of someone who believed his words carried more weight than the evidence itself. As he adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat, Marcus Hart didn't blink. He had expected this move, had studied Bryce's past testimonies in other high-profile cases, and he was ready. The defense attorney, Grant Maruro, paced deliberately in front of the jury. "Dr. Bryce," he began, You've reviewed the footage of the incident between flight attendant Clark Denham and the minor passenger. Correct. I have, Bryce said, voice smooth and measured multiple times from multiple angles. And based on your expert opinion, what did you observe in Mr. Denham's behavior? Bryce folded his hands, steepling his fingers. I observed signs of what we call pre-reflexive startle behavior. It's when someone is caught off guard and responds before conscious thought takes over. His shoulders flinch back, his arms move defensively, his face shows surprise. It's consistent with someone reacting out of fear. Fear of what Grant prompted. Bryce nodded. Of perceived physical aggression. The child's sudden movement could have been interpreted consciously or subconsciously as a threat. A low murmur rose from the gallery, quickly hushed by the judge. Marcus remained stone still. He could feel Keon shifting nervously beside him, his small frame tense beneath the oversized blazer he wore to court. Marcus gently placed a hand on his son's knee, not to calm him, but to remind him he wasn't alone. When the defense rested its case, the prosecutor, Mr. Holbrook, rose without ceremony. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he wheeled a large monitor to the center of the courtroom and turned to the judge. Permission to play the footage one final time, Your Honor, this time with motion mapping overlay. The judge gave a nod and the screen came to life. Frame by frame, the jury watched Clark Denham turn toward Keon. Digital markers appeared on Clark's body, the slow flex of his shoulders, the tightening of his right hand into a fist, the shifting of weight from his left foot to his right. The moment before the punch was undeniable, calculated, measured. Pause it there, Holbrook said. The screen froze on the frame. Clark's fist inches from Keon's jaw, his knuckles pulled tight, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. There was no flinch, no panic, only intent. My expert, Holbrook continued. Dr. Adrian Bell concluded that Mr. Denham displayed anticipatory aggression. He didn't react. He prepared, and this preparation began before the boy moved at all. Gasps echoed faintly. One juror covered his mouth, another leaned closer, but Holbrook wasn't finished. He turned toward Marcus and gave a small nod. Marcus gently leaned over and whispered to Keon, "Are you ready?" Keon nodded once, barely, then slowly stood. The entire courtroom turned as Keon, heart still healing, still fragile, stepped forward with the aid of a bailiff. His walk was careful, his mouth still held in a guarded position, but his eyes, those eyes, held strength. When he reached the witness box, he climbed the step and looked out over the sea of faces. He didn't flinch under the pressure. A child psychologist sat quietly at the end of the row, just in case he needed to be excused, but Keon didn't ask to leave. He was here for a reason. Mr. Holbrook stepped forward gently. "Keon," he said softly, "I'll only ask you 3 questions, that's all. If you need to stop at any time, just let me know. Is that okay?" Keon nodded. First question. Did you touch or try to touch Mr. Denham before he hit you? Keon shook his head. No. Second, did you say anything threatening to him again? No. Holbrook took a breath. And third, what did he say to you right before he hit you? Keon's lips trembled, but he took his time. His hands gripped the wooden edge of the box. He blinked. One slow blink, then another. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but didn't waver. He said, "Let's see you talk now." The words rang through the room like the crack of thunder. You could hear the breath leave people's chests. Even the judge paused, looking up from his notes. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Clark, sitting at the defense table, lowered his eyes. His attorney looked pale. Marcus didn't move. He didn't have to. Keon had said what no footage could. He'd spoken through pain, through fear, and broken through the last defense wall. The judge cleared his throat, visibly moved. That will be all for today. Court was adjourned until the following morning. The shuffle of papers and quiet footsteps filled the room as people stood still, shell-shocked from what they'd heard. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Gold light spilled across the courthouse steps, casting long shadows on the stone. Marcus sat beside Keon on the wide marble bench, neither of them speaking for a moment. Then Marcus turned to his son. "You were brave today," he told him. Keon nodded slowly and looked toward the sunset. For the first time since the flight, he smiled just faintly. Felix Ray's name had not appeared on any of the pretrial witness lists. That alone was enough to send a ripple through the courtroom. As the bay opened the side door and the young man entered, the jurors shifted forward slightly in their seats. He was tall, lean, with a slight limp that was noticeable even before he reached the witness stand. Every step seemed weighted, not just by injury, but by memory. Marcus watched him closely from the plaintiff's table, his fingers laced tightly together. Keon sat beside him, expression unreadable, though his eyes flicked to Felix with quiet curiosity. There was something different in the air now, something that even Clark's legal team seemed to sense. Grant Morrow, Clark's attorney, leaned in to whisper sharply to his junior associate. Clearly caught off guard, the judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Hart, please explain the relevance of this witness." Marcus stood slowly, voice calm. "Your Honor, Felix Ray is prepared to testify to a pattern of behavior by the defendant. Behavior that echoes the assault we're here to address." The judge studied Felix for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." Felix took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the courtroom, not with fear, but a kind of practiced resolve. "My name is Felix Ray. I'm 19 years old now, but when I was 14, I flew alone from Redwood Bay to Briar Glen. It was a Sky Reach flight. Clark Denham was the attending crew in my section. Do you recall anything unusual during that flight?" the prosecutor asked. Felix nodded. "Yes, I had trouble lifting my carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. I asked for help." His voice didn't tremble. If anything, it seemed to sharpen with each word. "Clark came over, looked me up and down, and said, 'You should learn to handle your own weight. You want to be a man. Act like one.' I tried again, but the bag slipped. He stepped forward, grabbed my shoulder, and shoved me down into my seat. My leg hit the metal armrest hard. He paused slowly, pulling up the cuff of his pant leg. A long, jagged scar ran from his knee to his shin. Audible gasps filled the courtroom. Marcus didn't move, but his jaw tensed. From the corner of his eye, he saw Keon's small hand move, resting gently on his. "Did you report this incident?" the prosecutor asked. Felix gave a bitter half-smile. "I did. My father filed a complaint. We even sent pictures of my leg, but weeks passed and we heard nothing. When he followed up, they said there was no record of the report. We dropped it. What else could we do?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of disbelief and the uncomfortable recognition that this story had echoes. Grant Maruro stood clearing his throat. "Objection. This is anecdotal, prejudicial, sustained," the judge said mildly, then turned to Felix. "Mr. Ray, your testimony is only admissible insofar as it relates to a behavioral pattern that could inform the jury's understanding of this case. Please limit your remarks accordingly." Felix nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." The prosecutor leaned in again. "Felix, can you describe Clark Denham's tone when he said those things to you?" "Demeaning, like I wasn't worth his time. Like I was a problem, not a person." Across the courtroom, Clark sat stone-faced. But Marcus noticed the twitch in his jaw, the restless movement in his foot. The defense hadn't expected this. They were losing control of the narrative, and they knew it. After Felix stepped down, Marcus took a long breath. He hadn't told anyone, not even Judge Durham, about bringing Felix in. He'd found him through a sealed complaint archived in a forgotten employee inbox, accessed only through a contact buried deep within Skyreach's former HR system. It had been a gamble, but one he'd been willing to take. When the courtroom settled, the prosecutor stepped forward for closing arguments. This case, he began pacing slowly, before the jury, has never just been about a punch. It's about a man entrusted with the care of the vulnerable, a man who used that power not to protect, but to harm, and not just once, not just by accident. We've seen that this was a pattern ignored, buried, and now finally brought into the light. He stopped in front of the screen where the paused image of Keon's injury, mid-frame, mid-impact, still hung like a frozen truth. "The people we entrust with power," he said, "must be held to account when they use it to silence the smallest voices among us." The courtroom door swung open with a heavy groan, and silence fell as the jury filed in. 12 expressions carved from stone took their seats, avoiding eye contact with either side. The foreman, a stern-faced man in his 50s, stood and cleared his throat. We, the jury, find the defendant, Clark Denham, guilty on all charges, aggravated assault of a minor abuse of authority in a custodial setting, and infliction of intentional harm. A gasp rippled through the gallery, then silence. Clark's shoulders sagged. His attorney, Grant Moraro, placed a hand on his client's arm, but Clark didn't look up. His jaw twitched a subtle signal of suppressed fury. The judge tapped his gavel once and spoke evenly. Sentencing will be held in 48 hours, pending review of newly submitted corporate evidence tied to the case. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot through the room as Clark was led out of the courtroom, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals' cameras flashed from the press section. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices bouncing off the marble walls. "Mr. Denham, do you regret your actions? Was it really self-defense? What do you say to the family?" Clark kept his head low, his eyes fixed on the tile floor. But beneath that mask of silence, something hardened. Rage, perhaps, or shame, maybe both. But outside the courtroom, the real reckoning had already begun. Marcus Hart stood with Judge Marcel Durham and Jason Redd in a quiet side hallway of the federal building. The walls here were bare, unadorned, and the air buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights. The 3 men looked as if they belonged in different worlds. Marcus in his gray tactical cut suit, Jason in a plain navy jacket with a frayed hem, and Durham in his immaculate black robe removed only moments earlier. Marcus held a manila envelope tight against his side. Inside were transcripts, timelines, and a list of whistleblowers who had remained silent for too long. He looked to the judge. "You're sure they'll listen?" Durham's voice was calm but firm. "They're already listening." "We speak in 20 minutes. The federal subcommittee hearing on aviation safety and employee conduct convened in a restricted conference room 2 floors above the courtroom. No cameras, no reporters, just 12 lawmakers and a long polished table where Marcus Durham and Jason now sat beneath the seal of the Department of Transportation. Representative Alan Brenner, chairing the session, adjusted his microphone. "We've reviewed the footage and the trial record, but we're particularly interested in your findings, those not admitted during the public proceedings." Marcus leaned forward. His voice was level, but there was weight behind every word. This wasn't just one flight attendant losing his temper. This was years of buried reports, internal silencing, and corporate negligence. "We brought proof." He passed the envelope down the table. One by one, the committee members began to read. 4 internal complaints each with names, dates, witness summaries. None had ever reached upper management. One had even been marked resolved after a settlement, though no settlement was ever issued. "The patterns were clear," Jason added quietly. "I signed off on one of those files under pressure. I was told it was handled in-house. I carried that for years." Durham followed his tone, now judicial. "Skyreach had a policy of shielding employees like Clark Denham under the guise of performance protection that created a culture of impunity. The next 2 hours unfolded like a controlled demolition. Each piece of evidence, each sworn statement chipped away at the airline's carefully curated image. The turning point came when Marcus read aloud a line from an internal memo he had retrieved. "Avoid escalating passenger complaints related to legacy crew, especially if they involve minors. They're unreliable witnesses." By the time the hearing adjourned, the air in the room had changed. Tension had turned into quiet determination. The subcommittee chair stood and addressed the room. "We'll be issuing a recommendation for immediate federal oversight into employee conduct protocols at Skyreach. This pattern cannot be ignored." The statement reached the press before Clark's prison van had even left the courthouse. Within 3 hours, Skyreach's CEO, Leonard Graves, held a brief stammering press conference. "In light of recent revelations, I'm stepping down effective immediately." No questions were taken. That same day, a national audit was announced. All major U.S. carriers would be reviewed for their handling of passenger complaints, particularly those involving children and disabled individuals. Skyreach's stock plunged by 11% in a single afternoon, but Marcus didn't flinch. He was sitting quietly in the courthouse atrium as the reports rolled in. Keon sat beside him in his navy hoodie legs tucked under the bench. The boy still didn't talk much in public, but he watched the scrolling headlines on Marcus's phone with careful eyes. When Marcus locked the screen, Keon shifted closer. Marcus looked down at his son and smiled faintly. The noise of the day, the media frenzy, the hearings, the resignations, it all quieted in that moment. Keon leaned his head on his father's shoulder. The warmth was gentle, trusting. "Thank you," he whispered. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the judge returned to the bench. Clark Denham stood between his two attorneys, his face pale and unreadable. The tension had mounted over the past hour, every breath from the gallery held in anticipation. The jury's verdict had come swiftly, but this moment's sentencing was the reckoning. "Mr. Denham," the judge began, his voice firm and echoing across the room. "This court finds it especially disturbing that the victim in this case was not only defenseless but placed under your supervision for protection. You failed that duty in the most violent way possible." Clark didn't flinch. He stood stiffly, eyes fixed on the judge's chest rather than his face. There was no apology, no plea, just silence, like he believed it might somehow lessen the weight of the decision. "You are hereby sentenced to 9 years in federal prison," the judge concluded. Without the possibility of early parole, a few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Reporters shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes while others typed furiously on tablets. Clark's lawyer, Grant Maruro, leaned in to whisper something, but Clark didn't respond. His posture slumped just slightly, as if the words had knocked the air out of him, not from surprise but from reality. Finally settling in, the courtroom guards approached. One clipped the handcuffs onto Clark's wrist with practiced precision. As they turned him to escort him away, a journalist called out, "Do you have anything to say to Keon Hart?" But Clark kept his eyes on the floor and his mouth shut, disappearing behind the side door with nothing left to offer. The hallway outside was a wall of flash bulbs and microphones, but the noise didn't reach Marcus Hart. He sat quietly beside Keon, who remained in his wheelchair, his jaw still slightly bandaged. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The judgment had landed, and yet Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was only the first thread pulled from a tightly woven net. Back in Washington, the headlines pivoted fast. While Clark's appeal was filed that same afternoon, the coverage barely acknowledged it. Instead, all eyes turned to the larger story unfolding. Judge Marcel Durham had been appointed by the Transportation Ethics Committee to lead a new civilian oversight panel focused on passenger safety and employee accountability across all major airlines. His presence in the trial and his early testimony had caught the attention of policymakers. Now he was tasked with ensuring no child would ever again board a flight vulnerable to unchecked violence. Keon's name was spoken on the Senate floor. Lawmakers on both sides referenced his case when discussing new travel protections for minors. Images of his bloodied shirt and trembling posture had become a painful symbol of what needed to change. But with that visibility came responsibility, and Marcus didn't shy away. He received 3 separate invitations to participate in think tank discussions on travel trauma, all of which he turned down. But then came a private message through Judge Durham's office. A federal subcommittee wanted Marcus to consult directly on crafting a national policy for trauma-sensitive travel standards. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with the letter for a full evening, watching Keon sleep curled under a blanket at the far end of the couch. The boy twitched occasionally in his rest, but his breathing was steady, stronger. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed the number listed. When a voice answered, Marcus said only one thing. "I'll do it, but on one condition." The representative paused. "Yes, sir. All proceeds, stipends, any payments from my involvement." Marcus continued, his voice low but resolute. "Go to a scholarship fund. I want it named after my son, the Keon Hart Initiative for Protected Passages." The ribbon snapped clean with the press of silver scissors. Applause followed, brief, polite, not overwhelming, but enough to make Keon blink from the noise. He stood beside his father, hands folded neatly in front of him, the breeze tugging gently at the navy blue blazer Marcus had picked out that morning. It was 6 months to the day, 6 months since the flight, since the punch, since the silence. Now they stood beneath the curved glass awning of Terminal C just outside the entrance to Skyline Airport's new children's safe lounge. A brightly lit sanctuary decorated with soft colors, low shelves of books, plush seating, and walls covered in murals of flying kites in distant cities. The space looked nothing like the cold, sterile gates that Keon remembered from that day. That was the point. This wasn't just a waiting area, it was a promise. The crowd began to thin as media crews packed up and airport staff resumed their duties. A few reporters lingered near the podium, but the attention had shifted. The cameras weren't on Keon anymore, and that somehow made it easier for him to breathe. "Want to see inside?" Marcus asked quietly, tilting his head toward the glass doors. Keon nodded, then glanced at the sign above them. The Keon Hart Safe Lounge for every child who flies alone. His name in bold letters. It didn't feel real. Inside the space was warm and quiet. Gentle piano music played from hidden speakers. One wall had a mural of a boy launching a paper airplane into a sky that curved around the entire room. A pair of men in blue polos. The trauma response staff offered smiles but didn't speak. They let the moment unfold. Keon walked slowly past a low bookshelf, his fingers trailing along the spines. Every book had a small sticker on it. Donated by KH Initiative. Near the far corner, a playmat with wooden building blocks lay untouched. He paused, crouched, and started to stack them one by one. Marcus watched him for a while, arms crossed, but his stance soft. "You okay?" he asked gently. Keon nodded again, not looking up. "Yeah," he said then after a pause. "It's quieter here." That's the idea. There was a weight in Marcus's voice, not heavy with sadness, but with reflection. This wasn't just a lounge. It was the result of months of relentless advocacy meetings with legislators, partnerships with airport authorities, and hours spent reimagining what safety could look like for traveling children. Marcus hadn't done it alone, but he had led every step with the quiet fury of a father who refused to let the story end at justice. "I told my therapist something yesterday," Keon said, still focused on his tower of blocks. Marcus knelt beside him, meeting him at eye level. "What's that?" I said. "Even if I stutter a little, they still listen." Keon looked up, his eyes calm but steady. "That used to scare me talking. I mean, like maybe no one would wait long enough to hear what I meant." Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. "They hear you now?" he said. Keon shrugged slightly. "Even if they didn't, I think I'd still talk." From behind them, one of the lounge staff approached. "Mr. Hart, there's a news anchor outside. Who'd like a word?" "Just a quick question, if you're willing." Marcus glanced down at Keon, who gave a tiny nod. "Go," he whispered. "I'll stay right here." Out by the terminal gates, a reporter waited beneath a boom mic, her notepad tucked beneath her arm. The camera crew wasn't rolling. It wasn't that kind of interview, just a quote, a headline. But Marcus took a breath before speaking. "How does it feel?" the reporter asked. "To see justice done?" He looked back through the glass where Keon now sat cross-legged on the playmat, quietly showing another boy how to balance blocks without them falling. No one told them what to say. No one directed them. It was just two kids being kids in a place that promised to protect them. Marcus turned back to the reporter. "Justice is never finished," he said, "but sometimes it starts with a boy who wasn't afraid to speak up." Keon stood beneath the soft glow of the overhead lights in Skyland Airport's newly built Safe Passages lounge, gripping the edges of a small note card with both hands. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the gravity of what this moment meant. In front of him, rows of children sat cross-legged on a brightly patterned rug, their eyes wide with curiosity and quiet respect. Some wore tags that read unaccompanied minor, just like the one he used to wear. Behind them stood staff members, airport officials, and a handful of carefully invited guests, men who had watched his journey unfold and some who had helped shape it. He cleared his throat, his voice still slightly raspy from recovery, and began to read. "I was hurt on a plane," he said slowly, each word deliberate, each syllable precise. A hush fell over the room. "But I am not just a victim." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. His gaze landed on his father, Marcus, sitting in the front row. Marcus nodded just once, firm and calm, giving Keon the silent strength to keep going. "I'm still flying," Keon continued, "and I want all of you to know that even when adults get it wrong, there are others who will fight to make it right." His hand trembled slightly, but his voice didn't break. As he lowered the card, a round of gentle applause rose from the audience. Not loud, not forced, just enough to echo a shared recognition of his courage. Marcus rose slowly to his feet, his eyes glassy, but his smile unwavering. Keon met his gaze, and for a brief second, it felt like the chaos of the past year had folded into something quiet, something steady. Standing a few steps behind the crowd were two men, Judge Marcel Durham and Jason Red, the former in a crisp gray suit, the latter in a simple collared shirt sleeves rolled up. They exchanged a glance, then turned their attention back to Keon, their expressions unreadable, but full of meaning. Both of them had seen what unchecked authority could do. Both of them had chosen in different ways to stop it. As the session wrapped, Keon stepped down from the small platform and was immediately greeted by several younger boys asking timid questions. "Were you scared? Did it hurt? What did they do after?" Keon answered with short but honest replies, careful not to scare them, but also not to soften the truth. The lounge, painted in bright colors with soft blue accents and decorated with flight-themed murals, felt like a safe space for the first time. An airport administrator approached Marcus quietly. "Your son," he said, nodding toward Keon. "He's stronger than most men I've met." Marcus didn't answer right away. He was watching Keon speak with a boy no older than 7, showing him the safest way to wear a seatbelt. "He shouldn't have had to be," Marcus finally replied. "But I'm proud that he is." The administrator left, and Marcus stepped forward to place a hand on Keon's shoulder. "Ready to go home?" Keon nodded, slipping the note card into his pocket like a badge. As they walked together through the corridor that led out of the lounge, the sounds of footsteps echoed gently off the tiled floor. The hum of planes outside the glass wall vibrated faintly in the background. Later that night back home, the air was cooler. Keon had taken a shower, changed into his favorite navy hoodie, and crawled into bed. Marcus sat on the edge of the mattress, flipping through a news app, but only half reading. He was still thinking about the workshop, about the way Keon had stood there composed, but unflinching, as if something inside him had fully settled into place. Keon rolled onto his side, watching the shadows dance on the wall. "Dad?" Marcus put the phone down. "Yeah, buddy." Keon's voice was soft but clear. "Do you think he's sorry?" The question hung in the air for a moment, uncomfortable, inevitable. Marcus looked at his son, then toward the ceiling, as if measuring his words. Maybe he said, "But whether he is or not, that's not our burden anymore." Keon nodded and pulled the covers tighter. He didn't have nightmares anymore, just dreams of clouds, wings, and open skies. "I'm not afraid of flying now," he whispered. "Not anymore." He thought no one of power was watching until Justice stood up from row 4. If you stand for dignity, protection, and consequence, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight the brutal consequences of abuse and racial injustice. Its purpose is to inspire conversations about accountability, respect, and the urgent need for fairness and protection in all environments.